Asheville. I gotta talk to my home city about that. She's like, no, it's okay. Don't blame me. It's from behind that gate that I watched the police roll up on my brothers and their friends, not one of whom was over the age of 14, and all of whom are doing absolutely nothing but talking. They throw them up on the wall. They make them pull their shirts up. They make them turn out their pockets. They roughly touch my brothers' bodies, even their privates, while from behind the gate I watch frozen. I cannot cry or scream, I cannot breathe, and I cannot hear anything. Not the siren that would have been accompanying the swirl of red lights, not the screeching at the boys, get on the effing wall. Later, I will be angry with myself. Why didn't I help them? And later, neither Paul nor Monty will say a word about what happened to them. They will not cry or curse. They will not make aloud, although empty threats. They will not discuss it with me, who was a witness, or my mother, who was not. They will not be outraged. They will not say that they do not deserve such treatment, because by the time they hit puberty, neither will my brothers have expected that things could be another way. They will be silent in the ways we often hear of the silence of rape victims. They will be worried, maybe, that no one will believe them, worried that there's nothing that can be done to fix things, make things better. Whatever goes through their minds after being half-stripped in public and having their childhoods flung to the ground and ground into the concrete, we will never speak of this incident or the ones that will follow as Van Nuys becomes ground zero in the war on drugs and the war on gangs. Designations that have even more license to police already empowered to do what they want to us. Now there are even more ways to make us the enemy, even more ways to make us disappear.
Well, Patrisse, it's amazing to hear you read. I have to say, I couldn't put your book down. And it was that kind of vividness, that kind of writing, and also the broader social analysis that just, I think I got it last Thursday, and I read it in 2 days. I was at the gym reading it, I was up late at night reading it, and I just thought, wow, the ability, the clarity to see what was happening to your family members and to you, and then to be able to step back and just say, look at the systems. Look at the broader context. It's not just them. And all of that comes together in such vividness, such clarity. I wonder if you can start us off just talking about, especially your parents. And I'll just say what resonated is the sense that they weren't there and yet it wasn't their fault. You were able to really see that it wasn't due to a lack of love or a lack of care, that there was something else at work. So if you could tell us about them.
Thanks everybody for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And I just want to say that when you grow up poor and you're socialized as female, you're really taught not to believe in your story. You're taught that your story is a story that's not necessary to be spoken, and a story that is not necessary for others to hear. And so the process of writing this memoir was, there were moments of challenge, because I was like, should I do this? Is it ethical? Is it, And I was pushed by my co-author in particular, where she would continue to say, yes, it's your story, but it's the story of so many Black folks who were raised poor across the country, who were in constant contact with law enforcement that dehumanized them and denigrated them. And so, we just pubbed a few days ago, and the response from people has been really amazing. And just a reminder why Black Lives Matter started in the first place, and why we'll continue to do the work that we do. My parents were and are amazing. My mother was a single mother who worked 3 jobs, and she really, really dedicated her life to her children, and she still does. And I think in reflection and writing this book, I just realized how much she was forced to miss our lives because of capitalism, because of racism, because of sexism, and that now as a new parent, how much I crave to be with my child and what it must felt like for my mother to have to choose feeding us and having shelter, giving us shelter over spending quality time with us. And I talk about it in the book about how I did not grow up going to movies with my mother or having casual conversations or her playing with us, because she was literally working from the moment I woke up to the moment I fell asleep at night. She wasn't the primary caretaker. She made sure we were fed, made sure we had shelter, but my brother, my oldest brother, was actually our primary caretaker. And just what kind of dynamic that must have been for her. And it wasn't until I had a child that I had a newfound and in-depth compassion for my mother and how much she gave and how much she gives. And same to say for my fathers. I mean, I grew up with two fathers, and I talk about this in the book, but one of my fathers is a mechanic. He worked at GM Van Nuys, and General Motors Van Nuys was pretty much one of the last plants left in the States during industrialization and deindustrialization. It was shut down, and from there he was really shuffled into mediocre menial jobs. And it was in that moment too where I saw a stark difference in his relationship to us, or his consistency with us. And my father, my biological father, suffered from drug addiction. And when he was well and present, he was present, and when he wasn't, he wasn't. All these things, now that I'm a grown-up, and now that and as I've been more politicized, I have a deep understanding of the ways that racism tears Black families apart. And this idea that it's our personal responsibility to, quote, get our lives together is incredibly dangerous. And it's the kind of rhetoric that I grew up having to ingest and eventually believe in and have to eventually unlearn, because it was the only thing told to us that, if only your mother wasn't a teenage mother, if only your mother wasn't poor, if only your father wasn't a drug addict, as if these things were our fault. As if there wasn't a system in place that created a significant amount of trauma, or a system in place that created my mother to have to work herself to the bone. And so the book really unfolds the historical context with a deeper context around why Black families end up being ripped apart.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I wonder if you can talk about also the way in which the state approached your brother, really traumatized your brother. And I'm specifically interested in one of the passages in which you talk about at length your brother Monty having an episode, and you and your family members are able to deal with it, and you say without calling the police. And there's a whole movement around trying to have communities deal with family problems or communal problems without police intervention in particular. And I wonder if you can talk about that, because that seemed like a very important short phrase, but very important for a larger, maybe philosophical argument you were making.
Well, I think perhaps it'd be best if I go back a bit, which is when I did call the police. And not because I wanted to, but because there was absolutely no other person to call. No infrastructure to help my family with my brother who has severe mental illness. He has schizoaffective disorder. And without giving too much away, because it's in the book, he comes home from prison for the first time, and he's in the middle of a manic episode, except nobody told us. And until that point, we didn't know my brother had mental health issues because he was in prison. And when he was released in his boxer shorts, flip-flops, and a t-shirt. And it was startling, it was disturbing, it was disgusting. But the days after his release, we didn't know what to do. And we called, the ambulance, and the ambulance, I made the wrong choice to say that he'd just been released from prison, and then they said, well, that if he's on parole, you gotta call the police, and I kind of begged the ambulance, I can't call the police. Don't make me call the police, and they said, sorry ma'am, we can't help you. And so I did call the police because he needed help, and so did we. And two rookie cops showed up, and I went down the stairs and I explained to them what was happening. And they said, okay, and I said, well, what are you gonna do if he happens to get violent? And they said, well, just tase him. And I said, okay, well, I can't have you do that. I'm not gonna let you tase my brother. And when they walked into the house, and the moment my brother saw them, he just dropped to his knees and put his hands up, and he started crying, and I was like, this was the wrong choice. So I sent them away. They didn't actually help. I sent them away, and as a family, we figured out how to get my brother to a hospital, which would be pretty much how we handle when or if my brother has an episode. At this point, we've trained ourselves how to de-escalate. And as part of the work that I do now, both with Black Lives Matter and the local work that I do as well, has everything to do with training families and communities on how to de-escalate people in mental health crises, so that we don't have to call the police, so we don't have to have a fatal interaction with law enforcement. My brother is 6'2", he weighs 300 pounds, and he's big black dude. And there's not one day that goes by where I'm not nervous about his safety when it comes to law enforcement. So, and I really was self-taught de-escalation, but there's lots of folks now that are doing amazing work around creating restorative and transformative justice spaces and training the communities and the people around your neighbors so that you can identify, oh, someone's in a mental health crisis, and these are the things that we can do to help this person. And we don't do enough of that. We don't support the most vulnerable people enough. And instead, we rely on law enforcement. And I think in many situations, it's absolutely unnecessary. And what we need is to train each other on how to deal with one another.
So this leads into the bigger work of Black Lives Matter, right? It's part and parcel of this larger vision for a different kind of world, one where we can be healthy, one where we can thrive, one where we can move with ease without the kind of fear you're talking about. And I wonder if you can talk to us about the vision and the origins of the movement, the fact that it's led by women. And I would like to expand that in the next question, but really to just hear your thoughts about what it's about fundamentally.
Black Lives Matter really begins in a time where many of us, specifically in sort of my generation, have been completely neglected by the state. As a generation who some of the highest unemployment rates for Black people and Black youth. It's a generation that has seen increased militarization of police in our communities. As a generation that has been has had very little investment in their communities, and the one single investment that we have is law enforcement in prisons. And it's a generation that I think feels the boot on the neck really poignantly. And so, when Trayvon Martin is killed, it doesn't hit mainstream media. It's not until Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon's mother in particular, starts to, tell folks, like, my child was killed and the murderer is sitting at home. But it takes that year during that trial, and every generation has their racially charged trial. I think this was ours. And I was naive. I thought George Zimmerman was gonna get something, maybe manslaughter, maybe not murder. But I didn't think he was gonna get to go home. I just didn't. And when I, when I was watching social media and watching the acquittal, and as he spoke, as the judge read the verdict, right? Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And it was like not guilty on all charges. It was a betrayal. I felt betrayed by this country. I felt betrayed by the it was like another betrayal. And I couldn't sit with that being the period. George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin is murdered. We go through a trial and George Zimmerman walks home free. That couldn't be the period. And so I was trying to figure it out. Like, what are we gonna do? Like, I know we're gonna hit the streets, but we gotta do more. Like, it has to feel like bigger than just going to protest for a few days and then we go back home. And I went online, this is like, social media is our public diary for better or worse. And I'm going online and I'm cursing everybody out and I'm like, if you're not talking about Trayvon, to get off my feet, and I'm pissed. And I go to Alicia's page because I've known her for a very long time, and she says a lot of different things, but the thing that stood out the most is she says Black Lives Matter. And I was like, that's it. And I put a hashtag on it, Black Lives Matter. And then I just started using the hashtag. And I called Alicia and I was like, let's do what? I first Facebooked her because we don't use our phones. And I Facebooked her and I was like publicly, not privately. I was like, hey, we should do something about hashtag Black Lives Matter. She's like, I'm with it. And then we got on the phone and I just was like, I think we need to do something. I think we can create something out of this. And she was like, let's do it. Like, let's figure it out. And Opal Tometi would join us a few days later. But July 15th, I would write a post on social media that would say, hey everybody, Alicia and I have started this thing called Black Lives Matter, and we hope that it impacts more than we can ever imagine.
So, in my own interpretation of this movement, what I find to be just extraordinary, so yes, 40 chapters globally, and the local movements and what it has meant for social media, and of course Ferguson. But on a different level, it's the fact that you have elevated queer identity, especially trans identity, but gender non-conforming identity, non-binary identity, alongside Black identity. And that is new. We haven't seen that before. That was not the Civil Rights Movement. That was not the Black Power Movement. That is new. And what I would love to hear from you is why that matters so much. Why the primacy, the privileging of queer identity, of trans identity.
I think what we wanted to intervene on very quickly is the idea that Black Lives Matter was just meant for Black cis men. It's really important, Black cis heterosexual men. It's really important that we made that intervention because in our own organizing as young queer Black women, we were often confronted with a significant amount of patriarchy and sexism and being told, kind of relegated to certain roles in the movement when we knew that not only Black women have always been at the helm of movements, the Civil Rights Movement, we've been the strategists, we've been the tactitioners. We talk a lot about how MLK has been sanitized and whitewashed, but let's talk about Rosa Parks. She's been completely minimized as this old woman who just happened to decide one day to sit down, and then she happened to tell the white guy that she wasn't gonna get up, as if it wasn't a part of a larger strategy, and as if she wasn't the one to help develop the strategy. So this idea that Black women are just being told what to do versus the being the ones who are developing whole movements and institutions, I think we wanted to set that record straight. And we wanted to do it also by modeling it, by not shying away from saying we're queer, that we are trans, that we are disabled, that we are formerly incarcerated, that we are convicted felons, that we are all these things, because Black people are so many things. And that was very important that we said that all Black lives matter. Every single one of us matter. And that we had to also model what we wanted, how we wanted other people to treat us. That it was up to us first. And that too many of us have been discarded. Too many of us have been thrown out. And that this was gonna be a new type of movement. It's not perfect. People still feel some kind of way, you know? But I think what I feel really grateful for is when I go to an event and, you know, young Black girls and young queer folks come up to me and they say, thank you. You know, thank you all for making yourselves visible for us. Because we opened up space. And so that's not a small feat.
It's definitely not. It strikes me, if any of you haven't gone to this website, the Black Lives Matter Network website, and the 11 principles, and 6 of the 11 talk about women and queer people as being front and center privilege. I think that is so important and extraordinary. And I want to pick up on this word you used, discard, because as I mentioned in the green room, recently read a blog post by your partner in which he talks about tensions, or they talk about tensions in the community. And very specifically, Future uses the word discard, that individuals get discarded. And I wonder if you can talk about these tensions amongst activists or within organizing communities.
Yeah, I think this is normal behavior whenever humans are together. And I say that because I don't want to pathologize our movement, because I think it's normal to have conflict. And I also think that conflict can be extremely generative. But on the flip, if we don't understand how to be in conflict, if we don't understand how to utilize conflict so that it is generative, then we have a lot of toxicity. And it's tricky because if you live in a culture, right, we are all subject to this culture. If we live in a culture that actually, you know, our nation was built off of such terrible, terrible things, it's hard not to embody that. And so that means we have to practice something different. And it means we have to train. I use this word a lot, train, because you have to undo things that you've learned, things that you embody and relearn, and embody them differently. And in our movement, I think it's why many of us have called for healing justice as a center point. And really thinking about the ways that we come into this. Many of us are traumatized. Many of us have, and feeling the impact of that trauma. And then we just sort of act it out, you know? And so how do we take care of ourselves? And I think you might get to this question, so if you want me to stop now, I can. And this is also a challenge to us, which is, it's not, once again, right? It's not just personal responsibility to take care of yourself. This is where like the collective care piece really comes in. I know that we've kind of used this self-care term, and I think it's an important part of the evolution around healing justice, but I think it's not good if we think it's the stop. Because self-care really does put responsibility on one individual to sort of fix themselves to be in this place. And we are a collective people. And so what I really try to talk about is collective care. And how do we create movements that aren't draining us, abusing us? How to create institutions that actually care for us? And how do we hold ourselves accountable so that other people don't have to? And this is interesting to me, that holding ourselves accountable. We're not always going to be able to do that, you know? Sometimes you're just ignorant of the things you're doing, and so someone has to be like, hey, that wasn't cool. And then, you know, ideally you'd be like, yeah, you're right, it wasn't cool. It doesn't always go like that. More than not, it doesn't. But if you were to have caused harm, and you know you did, what would it be like to actually go to the person and say, you know what, I know that was really terrible. Or I know that was kind of shady. Or, you know, and I'm sorry. And what can I do to fix this? What can I do to be held accountable? That creates a different dynamic. And that's what I'm really interested in us doing it.
While you're taking a water break, I will ask you just what that has looked like more personally. Because I think, yeah, take your time.
Does anyone have a cough drop?
Oh. There we go. Collective care. You've been traveling a lot.
Sorry, tissue. I'm almost there, guys.
So when you get a moment, and yeah, take your time. But I'm wondering, really to come back to the text, to the book that you've written that's so vivid. If you can think of a passage in here, and actually I'd be happy to read it for you if that's easier. Or an anecdote if you feel ready to talk, but where that kind of collective care comes out. So I'm actually thinking of a passage, if you want me to take a minute. It's from the chapter Say Her Name, hashtag Say Her Name. I'm going to assign this in both of my classes this semester. This chapter for both classes. And it's because it really, I even have it flagged. It's because it really stood out to me. I felt like, I read it several times, and I felt like reading it, that you were able to weave together so many different things. So, for example, when you talk about holding yourself accountable, I felt like you actually, in a very personal way, were able to do that. Going back to the question I raised about how you were able to embrace gender nonconforming and trans activists. So you talk about Ferguson in this chapter, and let me know if you want me to stop whenever you're ready. But if you want me to keep going, I'm happy to. Okay, so this is chapter, I don't know what number it is, but it's page 215. And you talk about how there's a van organized by Black trans women from Ohio. And so the work is extremely intense. There are tanks in Ferguson, there's tear gas in Ferguson. It's extremely intense. And all these activists, 600, right, in this freedom ride, arrive. And they will tell, these trans women from Ohio, right, will tell you that they didn't feel safe and that you didn't do enough. And it seemed like in reading your reflections on this that you were really able to hear that. You're really able to hear, okay, like we have to take different precautions. We have to think differently in this way. So in that way, I felt like you were really modeling through your words what it means to hear that critique And the critiques are hard, right? And you were able to say, okay, we didn't do enough.
I'm back. That happens every now and again. And when it's like in audiences, I'm like, oh, that's fine. But on TV, it's really scary and terrible. I'm like, no, I'm dying. This was important, actually, I wanted people to know that there is an evolution in Black Lives Matter around how we understand our commitment to trans folks in particular. And that was very intentional to start talking about Black trans women and also talk about the killings of Black trans women and the murders of Black trans women and having this be a part of how we talk about Black Lives Matter. And then that ride, Aaron, Lang, Cherno Biko, Ripley Bennett, all rode down from Ohio, from Columbus, Ohio, and they totally gave us really good feedback, specifically to myself and Donnell Moore, and said, you didn't do enough, but also we didn't acknowledge that they were there. And what that meant, you know, and that kind of like was really symbolic for how our communities don't acknowledge Black trans women, or the ways that we acknowledge them are really harmful. So that became that was an intervention early on that I'm still very deeply appreciative of. And yes, I could have said to them, well, you know, I could have got defensive. I totally could have got defensive, or I could have been like, well, you know, we'll deal with your issues later, you know. This is the most important issue right now. But we didn't. We said, you're right. We have to do better. And we challenged ourselves to do better.
Yeah, and it seems like that really shows, even now with the evolution of the movement, that critique gets taken seriously, or other critiques, right? Get heard, get taken seriously. Are there other tensions that you feel you want to talk about? Or I'm thinking about especially the way that maybe social media has been employed, and how, in a maybe dispersed network where there isn't a singular leader or a few leaders, the message can evolve depending on who is tweeting or who's on Facebook or what have you, and just what that is like for you as someone who stands behind certain principles, who has articulated this vision, who really stands behind the name Black Lives Matter, but then it's carried out, right? It's carried out worldwide even, and you don't have so much control over what's associated with it.
I mean, social media is a blessing and a curse.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. Social media is one of the ways we've been able to connect with Black people across the globe and have, 40 chapters across the globe. It's the way that we've been able to make and elevate some of the biggest issues of Black Lives Matter. And we've really, there are moments on social media where I'm like, oh, I gotta get out of here. Like, I'm not sure, I can't tell what's real anymore. And I think it's hard when you're in a movement that's decentralized, that's autonomous in nature, and that is trying to be leaders in different ways, We made it a very committed decision to challenge the idea of the charismatic leader, right? That we follow one person. We don't think we're leaderless. We actually call ourselves leaderful. And there are hundreds of Black Lives Matter leaders across the globe, which means that there's hundreds of opinions. And that's okay. It really is. But I think when it's not okay, it can end up online. And this is an interesting sort of like, on the one hand, I think the way I was trained is like, you keep stuff in circle, right? For a number of reasons. But on the other hand, if you're too closed, then that can feel really repressive. And like it lacks transparency. And so there's no easy fix in this. I'm not one to say that none of our, differing opinions should be on social media. But I know that I'm not interested in dragging Black activists or Black people on social media. I think that's a dangerous route to go down. And I think there's a difference between dragging someone and trying to hold someone accountable. Yes. And so we have to decide what that looks like. I don't think we've been intentional enough, because in a lot of ways, like, social media is new. We're all trying to figure it out and experiment with it. But I do think in this last year, I've realized, I think we need some rules to play on the playground, because it's like the wild, wild west out there. And so I'm in those thinkings right now.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing your thoughts, probably on social media, about those rules. So we're in this pivotal moment, speaking of the wild, wild west, because politically it's different terrain, right? We had some sense of how an Obama White House would respond. At least some sense of sympathy, of awareness of what confronts Black people, of policing, if nothing else. And you do talk a bit about Obama in the book, in terms of the downsizing of a federal prison population and what have you. But this is new terrain, and we're wondering, do you have thoughts about strategy, knowing that Trump has come out and endorsed police violence against activists? To begin with, not to mention, well, we should mention the extraordinary and explicit racism that has been articulated. What are your thoughts at this point in the movement and what the movement should be doing?
Everything and anything in our power to make sure that he's not in office in 2020. I think part of our work is twofold. One, I'm a really, really big fan of local work. Local work changes the national landscape. And so dig in locally. And I think that's going to be really important as we build power. And as we build the power of folks, we're in a midterm election year. Who we bring in our state to run it is critical, especially as Attorney General Jeff Sessions is trying to usher back in the height of the war on drugs by going after marijuana. How boring. I'm like, you're so late, dude. We discussed this already. Everybody's fine for the most part. I don't know why that's the drug you're going after, but we know why. Because it's another excuse to enact racism. So, and I think as far as Trump, the other day, I tried not to watch him as much as possible, or follow him on Twitter. I need to be aware. It's like a scary spider, You're like, okay, I'm aware you're there, but I'm not trying to look at you. But what I think is interesting about him that I figured out, because everybody did this whole thing, he's crazy, which I was really offended by. I thought it was really, terrible to make his racism and patriarchy and sexism be called crazy. I think that's disrespectful and so whatever. They did that test on him. He's fine. And then I was like, oh, right, he's just a terrible human being. And I think that's good information for us, because I think we're all trying to make sense of this man. And I'm just like, he's a racist, and he's a sexist, and he's a terrible human being. And I think we need to just be like, that's the reality. So let's move forward. We don't have to we don't need to, what is he saying in this tweet? Who cares? I'm much more interested in how we're gonna make sure that our families are safe, that we make sure ICE agents don't continue to deport our folks, that we ensure that we're not building more jails and prisons, and that ultimately we get him out. We get him out. And so that to me is do everything. There's not one strategy right now. I'm a firm believer in a multi-pronged strategy. If your thing is electoral justice, great. Let's do electoral justice. If your thing is grassroots organizing, if you have a union, anything you can do to build the power of folks, anything you could do to destabilize this very unstable moment that we're in, anything that we can do to create a different culture, a different norm. This book wasn't just me being like, I'm gonna write a memoir and I'm gonna tell you everything about my life. I'm an organizer. So in a lot of ways, this book is an organizing tool. That's what I see it. Let's refocus ourselves. Let's remember, let's not have us be so distracted that we end up having the war on drugs be reissued into our lives, that we end up living the way we were in the 80s and 90s, right? We're on the precipice of that. And so I'm proud of us though. Like, I was very depressed November 8th. I really was. I was like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm taking me and my child and we're out of this country. And then 2 weeks later, I had a reality check and said, okay, you live here, you're in this movement. And then we started winning things. We've lost a lot, but we're also winning. And I want to remind folks to claim our victories.
I did think that the book ended on this incredibly optimistic note, and it was really fierce. It was really, we're gonna take our future, we're gonna make our future, and there was nothing apologetic. There was this phrase, unapologetically Black. I felt like that was the note you ended on. This determination that came through. So we have some questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask you one last question, and it really actually does relate to some of what you talked about just now with the penal system, and it's this phrase restorative justice, and sort of how you understand that in relation to this next phase of dismantling the police state.
Yeah, I think we have to think about the last 40 or 50 years and what we've seen in relationship to what has been invested in. And what we've seen invested in is police and jails, prisons, courts, the expansion of these economies, and the detriment it has had. And so the argument becomes, well, what actually, if their argument is these are things that keep us safe, and our argument is this has actually kept us unsafe, well, what will keep us safe? And a part of that work is bringing in not just new terms, but new practices. Restorative justice is one of them, for sure. And I think some folks, at least in the work that I do, have evolved into really looking at transformative justice. Because some of us say that there's nothing to restore back to. There's nothing that what we were in or are in, I would not want to restore myself back to that. But transforming the systems and the conditions, that's what I'm interested in. And I think this piece around living in a nation that is bent on punishment as the model in which how we relate to people, we have to shift that, and transformative justice begs us to do that. And it puts a new sort of clarity on what we must do and how we must do it.
Thank you, Patrisse. We are... You're so very clear. We have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask 4 questions that were written on note cards that I thought were especially poignant. So I actually held off some of my own questions thinking we'll get to this. And the first question that came up is, how has your increased activism affected your relationships with friends, family, etc.? Talk a lot about this, a lot.
It's hard, it's lonely. There's such great camaraderie. I've made some of my closest friends in this moment. And it's also, I don't get to be home much. I have a child, and while I have a really great family, leaving and not being home is hard. It's difficult. And I think, I think about this a lot because I don't know how many folks remember when Rebecca Walker, Alice Walker's daughter, wrote pretty much an open letter to everybody like, y'all, my mama ain't, she ain't the mama that y'all think she is. And I always say, I joke around, I say, I don't want to be Rebecca Walker for my child. But this becomes a real tension for us as organizers and activists, especially for those of us who end up, being called to really be national figures, is how much we are in relationship to the people who we want to be meeting and inspiring, and also our own families and friends and communities. And I have really pushed myself in this last year to have more fun. That looks like going to the arcade. It's a lot of fun. It looks like going to concerts or doing things that are outside of movement work, which can be really easy to sort of just suck yourself in and be like, that's all I know how to do. And then it makes you really antisocial. So I don't want to do that. And I want to be present for people in my community. And I think that it just takes work to do that.
I have to say, one of the things that struck me reading your book is that you have people, community. You really actually note this over and over. For someone like me who's just moved and moved and moved, I felt envious. Like, you have people. Yeah, and it really shows. Yeah. So another question from our audience is, how do you balance online activism and mental health and your emotional stamina? Not a small question.
I don't know, that might be like a community circle conversation. I don't know if I balance it, but I try. Having a child in the middle of this movement moment and then being postpartum was very hard. I had a lot of difficulties. I deeply believe in therapy. I think that should be part of our reparations package as Black people. So I'm a big fan of therapy. I've been doing therapy since I was 21 and I'm 34. I'm a big fan of body work, massage, acupuncture, movement, any type of movement I think is important. And then being with people, we're social creatures, we gotta be in community. So whether that's just sitting in a circle and talking, or if you go to a spiritual center or a church, being in community is really critical for our mental health. Oh, and I had to take certain social media platforms off my phone because I was doing too much. A bit of an obsessive personality, and so I just had to take some apps off my phone. And sometimes my friends will tell me, or my partner will tell me, all right, MF, take a day off, take 48 hours off. And you totally get to do that, because there's real people you can touch. You don't have to be online all the time.
Another question is, do you see a strategy to connect the narratives of poor Black and brown urban communities, Native American resistance struggles, and poor white rural communities to recognize valid fusion in a struggle for social, economic, and ecological justice?
Is that someone's dissertation? course I see that, and how we're practicing it. I think some of the most beautiful moments was during Standing Rock. And I got to, I mean, there was, you know, and how many, raise your hand if you went to Standing Rock. Only one person in the room, Asheville? Well, me and you. It was very powerful. There was a lot of other things, but it was an experiment on like, can we do this thing together? And I feel very similar with Black Lives Matter. It's an experiment on governance. Can Black people govern? Of course we can, but how and in what way? And Standing Rock, because it was like, come, stand with us, be with us, and endure the tear gas, endure the police. All types of people were there. And for Black Lives Matter, we were requested to come. The folks at Standing Rock, you know, called for Black Lives Matter to come in solidarity, and we did. We went several times, and we brought delegations. But I think this piece around how we bring our movements together, but specifically the compilation of movements that the person asked, takes a sort of practice. And when we come together, it can't just be in action moments or crisis moments. We have to build together. We have to be in community together. And I think that is the sort of, therein lies the rub, because it's easier to do something when there's a crisis, right? My family, if someone dies, we all come together. But what about the in-between times? And how are we building with each other? And those are the times that I feel like are the most tender and the most right, because you get to learn little things like, you know, people's pet peeves and what they're excited about, and you know, their goals and their dreams. And I think those are really important moments.
What comes to mind is attending a church. I've just started going to church with my family, and I'm in a workshop about money. I'm hearing all these people talk about money and their money struggles, and thinking that is how you build community. And we hear them in their most intimate, least visible, you know, practices. Yeah. We have a question about white allies. What role should white allies play in creating community defense infrastructure, like community policing?
Well, I think last night I got this question. I get this question everywhere I go. And I got this question in Philly, and there was a Surge chapter in Philly, and I don't know if they have a Surge chapter. So, I mean, I think there's different ways white folks can be allies in this moment. One is joint organization, and I'm not a big fan of people being individuals doing their own things. I think we have to be in organization. We do, it's necessary. And I'm not a big fan of us sort of thinking that we're gonna be the savior, you know, to fix something. I know that if there's, in Los Angeles, we have a White People for Black Lives, and they've been doing really amazing work around allying with Black people and Black organizations in Los Angeles. So I think looking at ways in which organizing is already happening, trying to model some of that, asking questions around what's necessary. Each city, each place, each town has their own needs. And I think looking to the leadership of people of color and asking, how can I be supportive, goes a long way.
Well, Patrisse, we're gonna do book signings up here, but I wanna ask, is there any last word you want to conclude with? Is there something that really comes to mind for you, especially as you've been on tour, you've been doing lots and lots and lots of interviews, I've listened to some of them. I think you've, in each one, articulated something different. I wonder if there's just one more thing you would like us to hear.
Just that it's really important to tell Black stories.
Yes.
It's really important. And what's even more important is to listen